have evidence to suggest that an abduction took place at this time.
Is it something you're still investigating, whether or not they could have been abducted?
But the contradiction itself was documented, noted, added to the growing list of inconsistencies that made this case feel less like a tragedy and more like a cover-up. And then there was the backpack. Lilly's backpack, white with strawberry prints, was described in detail by Daniel. He said she had it with her when she disappeared, that it was one of the items search teams should look for. A backpack is significant. It suggests preparation, intention. A child doesn't grab a backpack to play in the yard. A backpack implies they were going somewhere, or that someone wanted it to look like they had gone somewhere. But like the blanket, like Jack's clothing, the backpack was never found. Not a strap, not a buckle, not a scrap of strawberry-printed fabric. It simply didn't exist in the physical evidence, which meant it either never left the house, or it was removed in a way that left no trace. Both scenarios point away from the official story. Now, let's talk about the boots. Lilly's pink boots and Jack's blue dinosaur boots were described as items the children were definitely wearing. Boots are important in a search. They leave distinct tread patterns. They protect feet, which means children can walk farther, and they're durable items that don't decompose or disappear easily. Finding a boot would be a massive break in the case. And yet, despite extensive ground searches, despite K-9 units trained to detect even the smallest human artifacts, despite volunteers crawling through underbrush on their hands and knees, no boots were ever recovered. What was found, and this is critical, was one set of boot prints. 2 small impressions in the dirt near the back of the trailer, approximately 10 feet from the door. Just 2 prints. Not a trail, not a path, not multiple impressions showing movement or play. Just 2 isolated prints, as if someone had placed a child's foot down twice and then picked them up again. Search and rescue experts looked at those prints and immediately recognized how strange they were. When children walk, they don't leave 2 perfect prints and then nothing. They shuffle, they jump, they drag their feet, they run in circles. Every step creates a new impression, and over the course of even a few minutes of outdoor play, you would expect to find dozens, if not hundreds, of partial and full prints throughout the immediate area. But there were only 2. 2 prints that suggested not genuine play, but staging. An attempt to create evidence of the children being outside, evidence that was so minimal and so poorly executed that it actually raised more suspicions than it resolved. Investigators photographed those prints, measured them, documented their location. And then they asked the obvious question, if these prints belong to Lilly or Jack, where are all the others? Where are the prints leading to the woods? Where are the prints near the areas where children would naturally play, near the trees, near any makeshift toys or play structures? The answer is there aren't any, because those children likely never walked outside that morning. Those 2 prints were all someone had time to create before calling it in, before the story had to become official. And like every other detail in this case, they don't suggest a tragedy. They suggest theater. If you're still with me, if you're seeing the pattern emerging here, then I need you to do something. I need you to like this video right now because we're about to go even deeper. We're about to talk about the door itself, the sliding glass door that supposedly opened without a sound while 2 adults slept just feet away. And when you understand the layout of that trailer, when you understand how sound travels in a space that's small, you'll realize that the story Daniel and Malaya told isn't just unlikely. It's impossible. And that impossibility is what made investigators stop searching the forest and start searching for something else entirely. Tell me in the comments, do you believe those boot prints were real evidence, or were they planted? Because what we're about to examine next, the physical layout of the house and the acoustics of that space, is going to make it very clear that someone is lying. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. There are certain things in criminal investigations that are considered near certainties. DNA evidence can identify someone with extraordinary precision. Fingerprints can place a person at a scene. And search dogs, properly trained K-9 units with years of experience, can find human beings in conditions that seem impossible. They can detect a person buried under 10 feet of snow. They can locate a body submerged in water. They can track a scent trail days after someone has passed through an area. These dogs are not infallible, but they're close. When a K-9 9-unit fails to find any trace of a missing person, it's not just unusual. It's a signal that something is fundamentally wrong with the scenario. In the case of Lilly and Jack Sullivan, multiple K-9 units from different agencies, with different specializations, were deployed across the search area. Tracking dogs, cadaver dogs, air scent dogs, each type trained for specific purposes, each bringing decades of combined experience. And every single one of them came up empty. Not a single alert. Not a single indication that Lilly or Jack had been anywhere in those woods. It was unprecedented. Let me explain how scent tracking works, because understanding this makes the failure even more significant. When a human being moves through space, they shed microscopic skin cells constantly. These cells, along with bacteria, oils, and other biological material, create a unique scent signature. This scent attaches to surfaces, vegetation, ground cover, and remains detectable for hours, sometimes days, depending on environmental conditions. Tracking dogs are trained to identify this specific human scent and follow its trail. They can distinguish between different people, can ignore distractions, can work in rain, snow, heat, any condition. The area surrounding the Sullivan property was actually ideal for scent tracking. The forest was dense, yes, but that's an advantage. Tree cover protects scent from wind dispersion. The ground was moist from recent rain, which helps scent particles settle and remain stable. The temperature was cool, which slows scent degradation. Every environmental factor was favorable. If those children had walked into those woods, even hours before the search began, the dogs should have found their trail within the first sweep. But they didn't. The tracking dogs, released at the back door where the children had supposedly exited, circled, sniffed, and showed no interest in any particular direction. They didn't alert. They didn't pull toward the woods. They behaved as if no fresh human scent existed beyond the immediate vicinity of the house. The air scent dogs, which don't follow a specific trail but instead search broadly for any human scent in an area, were deployed across wider search grids. They moved through the forest in systematic patterns, checking hollows, checking dense underbrush, checking anywhere a small child might hide or become trapped. And they found nothing. No alerts, no indications, no interest. Then came the cadaver dogs, and this is where the case takes an even darker turn. Cadaver dogs are trained to detect human decomposition, the specific chemical compounds released when a body begins to break down. These dogs are frighteningly accurate. They can alert on remains that are years old, buried deep, or submerged underwater. They've found bodies that human searchers would never have discovered. When cadaver dogs were brought to the Sullivan property and the surrounding area, everyone involved understood what that meant. The search had shifted from rescue to recovery. The hope was no longer that Lilly and Jack would be found alive. The hope was that they would be found at all, that their remains could be located and their family, despite everything, could have some form of closure. The cadaver dogs swept the property. They checked the house, the yard, the outbuildings, the vehicles. They moved into the woods, covering the areas where searchers thought remains might have been concealed. And again, nothing. No alerts. No indication that any human decomposition had occurred anywhere in the search area. For the K-9 handlers, this was baffling. In their experience, a failure this complete, across multiple dog types, across multiple days of searching, across optimal conditions, doesn't happen unless something is very wrong with the foundational assumption of the case. And the foundational assumption was that Lilly and Jack had left the house and entered the woods. What if they hadn't? What if they never made it outside? What if whatever happened to them occurred inside that trailer, and their bodies were removed in a way that left no scent trail for the dogs to follow? That possibility, grim as it is, would explain the failure of the K-9 units. If the children were carried rather than walking, if their bodies were placed in containers or wrappings that prevented scent dispersal, if they were moved by vehicle to a location completely outside the search area, then the dogs would find nothing. Because there would be nothing to find. Some experts, trying to make sense of the failure, suggested that the concentration of the children's scent around the house might have overwhelmed the dogs. If Lilly and Jack had been playing in and around the trailer for days, their scent would be everywhere, on every surface, saturating the environment. In theory, This could make it difficult for tracking dogs to distinguish a fresh trail from residual scent. But that explanation doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Tracking dogs are specifically trained to work in high-scent environments. They can track a person through a crowded city, through a house where multiple people live, through areas where the target individual has been many times before. They do this by identifying the freshest scent, the most recent trail, and following it. If Lilly and Jack had walked into the woods that morning, their fresh scent trail would have been distinct from the older, ambient scent around the house. The dogs would have found it. Unless, of course, there was no fresh trail to find. And that brings us back to the search itself, the one that started big, then stopped, then resumed in a way that made no sense unless you understood what investigators were really looking for. For the first 7 days after the report was filed, the search was extensive. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras, which can detect body heat even through tree canopy, swept the area in grid patterns. Drones with high-definition cameras recorded every inch of terrain. Ground teams, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, moved through the forest shoulder to shoulder, checking every ravine, every hollow log, every dense thicket. Searchers waded through streams, checked culverts, examined abandoned structures. It was exhaustive. And then, on day 7, it stopped. No explanation was given. No press conference was held to announce the suspension. The helicopters stopped flying, the drones were grounded, the volunteers were sent home. For 10 days, the woods fell silent. The public was confused. Families of missing children don't just call off searches. They expand them, they escalate them, they refuse to give up. But this search was suspended as if someone had made a calculated decision that continuing was pointless. Then, without warning, the search resumed. But it didn't resume in new areas. It didn't expand outward to cover more territory. Instead, search teams returned to the house, to the immediate property, to the ground they'd already covered in those first frantic days. And they brought cadaver dogs back with them. This wasn't about finding 2 lost children anymore. This was about finding evidence of what had happened to them, about locating remains, or traces of remains, or anything that would confirm the darkest suspicions that had been growing since day 1. The decision to return specifically to the property, to re-examine areas that had supposedly been cleared, tells you everything about where the investigation had actually shifted. Police weren't looking in the woods because they didn't believe the children had ever made it to the woods. They were looking at the house, at the people inside it, at the timeline that didn't make sense, and the story that kept changing. And then came the surveillance request, and this is where the RCMP's strategy becomes crystal clear. In a public appeal, police asked residents in the area to review any security camera footage, trail cameras, dash cameras, or personal surveillance systems they might have. Standard procedure in a missing persons case. You want to capture any possible sighting, any vehicle that might have been in the area, any detail that could provide a lead. But here's what made this request extraordinary. Police didn't ask for footage from May 2nd, the day the children were reported missing. They asked for footage from April 27th onward, 5 days before the official disappearance date. April 27th. Let that sink in. The RCMP was asking civilians to check recordings from 5 full days before the parents claimed their children had vanished.
Why?
Because investigators knew, or strongly suspected, that the real timeline was much earlier than what they'd been told. Because the gap in school attendance, the lack of external sightings, and the inconsistencies in the parents' stories all pointed to something having happened well before May 2nd. By requesting footage from April 27th forward, police were signaling, as clearly as they could without making a public accusation, that they didn't believe the official story. They were investigating a completely different timeline, one that started days earlier, one that the parents had concealed. And if they were concealing the timeline, what else were they concealing? One neighbor, who lived approximately 300 meters from the Sullivan property, told reporters something that sent chills through the community. They said they didn't even know children lived in that house. In a rural area where neighbors, though distant, generally have some awareness of who lives nearby, the fact that Lilly and Jack were essentially invisible speaks to a level of isolation that wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. If you're watching this and you're starting to see the full picture, the web of deception, the concealment, the misdirection, then I need you to subscribe right now. Because what comes next, the interior of that house and what was found inside, is going to make everything we've discussed so far even more disturbing. We're about to talk about the sliding glass door that supposedly opened silently, about the layout of a space so small that every sound echoes, and about what forensic teams actually discovered when they finally got inside. Tell me in the comments, do you think the police knew from day one that this wasn't a search and rescue operation? Because everything we're about to examine suggests they did. And if they knew, then every day that search continued, every press conference, every public appeal, was part of a larger strategy to build a case while appearing to look for children they believed were already gone. There's a technique in criminal investigations called the silent reveal. It's when law enforcement knows something significant, but they don't announce it publicly. They don't hold a press conference. They don't update the media. Instead, they make a quiet request, issue a subtle call for information, and watch who responds. And more importantly, they watch who doesn't. In the case of Lilly and Jack Sullivan, the RCMP's request for surveillance footage from April 27th onward was exactly that kind of move. To the casual observer, it might have seemed like standard procedure, just investigators being thorough, casting a wide net. But to anyone paying attention, anyone who understood what that date meant, it was a revelation. It was the RCMP telling the world, without actually saying it, that they knew the official story was a lie. April 27th was a Saturday. 5 full days before May 2nd, the Friday when Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks Murray called police to report that their children had vanished that morning. 5 days before the frantic search began, before helicopters filled the sky, before volunteers combed the woods looking for 2 small children who'd supposedly wandered away from home. But if police were requesting footage from April 27th, that meant they believed something significant could have happened as early as that date. It meant the timeline the parents had provided, the story of the children playing outside Friday morning and wandering into the woods, was not being taken seriously by investigators. It meant that everything the public had been told, everything the media had reported, was potentially false. And it meant that for days, possibly a full work week, Lilly and Jack Sullivan had been hidden from the world before anyone even knew they were missing. Think about what that means practically. April 27th was a Saturday. April 28th was a Sunday. Then came Monday the 29th, the last day the school bus driver saw the children. Then Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 3 days where the children were supposedly homesick, but no one outside the house saw them. And then Friday, May 2nd, when the parents finally called police. That's 6 days. 6 days where anything could have happened. 6 days where the only witnesses were the 2 adults who would eventually become the primary suspects in whatever this case actually was. By requesting footage from the 27th, police were essentially saying, we need to see who came and went from that property during the entire week leading up to the report, because we believe the crime, whatever it was, happened sometime during that window. It was a bold investigative move, and it told the community something that the official statements had been carefully avoiding. This was no longer a missing persons case. This was a homicide investigation, or at the very least, a suspicious death investigation, and the timeline everyone had been working from was wrong. But here's what makes this even more significant. By the time the RCMP made this request for surveillance footage, they'd already conducted extensive interviews with the parents. They'd already heard Daniel and Malaya's story multiple times, had noted the inconsistencies, had documented the changing details. They'd already talked to the school bus driver, the teachers, the neighbors. They'd already deployed K-9 units that found nothing. They'd already suspended and resumed the search in a way that indicated a shift in strategy. All of that had happened before they made the surveillance request public, which means investigators had already concluded, based on everything they'd seen and not seen, that the events of May 2nd were fabricated, that the real story began days earlier. And now they were trying to build a case that could prove it. One of the neighbors who responded to the surveillance request said something revealing. They told reporters they were glad police had finally come around to asking, that they'd expected investigators to canvass for camera footage much earlier in the case. And they added something else, something that hinted at a darkness beneath the surface of this entire story. They said there'd been unusual activity around the Sullivan property in the days and weeks before the children disappeared. Cars coming and going at odd hours. people they didn't recognize, movement that didn't fit the pattern of a quiet family living in isolation. They'd noticed it, but hadn't thought to report it because, well, what was there to report? Suspicious activity isn't a crime. Unfamiliar visitors aren't evidence of wrongdoing. But in retrospect, in the context of two missing children and a timeline that didn't add up, that activity took on a sinister cast. Because what if whatever happened to Lilly and Jack wasn't spontaneous? What if it wasn't an accident, a moment of rage, a terrible mistake? What if it was something that had been building, something tied to the kind of people who were frequenting that property, the kind of activities that happened behind closed doors? The RCMP never confirmed what, if anything, they found on those surveillance recordings. That information remains sealed, part of an ongoing investigation that, years later, still hasn't resulted in charges. But the fact that they requested it, the fact that they specifically asked for footage from 5 days before the official report, tells you everything you need to know about what investigators actually believed. They believed the crime happened earlier. They believed the parents had waited, had prepared, had crafted their story during those gap days. And they believed that somewhere in those recordings, there might be evidence of vehicles leaving the property, of unusual activity, of something that could help them prove what they already knew but couldn't yet demonstrate in court. Now, let's talk about what that extended timeline means for the physical evidence, or the lack thereof. If Lilly and Jack died or disappeared on May 2nd, the morning their parents claimed, then the scene would have been relatively fresh when police arrived. There would have been less time for cleanup, less time for evidence to be removed or contaminated, less time for a story to be perfected. But if the actual event happened days earlier, on April 27th or 28th or 29th, then the parents had 72 hours, maybe more, to alter the scene. To clean, to remove items, to dispose of evidence, to rehearse their statements until they sounded natural. That window of time, those gap days, they're not just significant for establishing a timeline. They're significant because they represent opportunity. Opportunity to make a crime scene disappear. And when you consider how little evidence was found, how thoroughly the house and property had been cleaned, how few traces of the children existed anywhere investigators looked, that extended timeline starts to make horrible sense. Someone had time to be thorough, time to be careful, time to make sure that when police finally arrived, there would be nothing left to find. And that level of planning, that degree of concealment, it doesn't happen after an accident. It doesn't happen in the chaos following an unexpected tragedy. It happens when someone knows they've committed a crime and they're determined not to get caught. But there was one thing the parents couldn't control, one element they couldn't manipulate no matter how much time they had. The school records, the bus driver's testimony, the external witnesses who could definitively say when they last saw those children alive. And that's what broke the case open, at least in terms of public understanding. Because once it became clear that Lilly and Jack hadn't been seen since April 29th at the latest, once that 3-day gap became undeniable, the entire investigation pivoted. It stopped being about where the children went and started being about what happened to them before anyone was looking. The surveillance request from April 27th was the RCMP's way of confirming their suspicions, of building a timeline that could withstand scrutiny in court. Because in criminal cases, especially those without bodies, without physical evidence, without witnesses, timeline is everything. If they could prove that something happened to those children days before the parents reported it, that alone could be enough to secure charges. Not for murder necessarily, not without remains, but for concealment, for obstruction, for evidence tampering, for giving false statements to police during a major investigation. The wheels of justice move slowly, and sometimes they move toward charges that aren't the full truth, but are what can be proven beyond reasonable doubt. And here's something that should terrify you about this case, about the strategy that may have been employed by whoever harmed these children. If you know that a child has died, whether through accident or intent, and you wait days before reporting it, you accomplish several things. First, you give yourself time to remove physical evidence from the scene. Blood can be cleaned, surfaces can be scrubbed, items can be disposed of. Not perfectly, not in a way that would fool forensic luminol testing, but enough to create reasonable doubt. Second, you corrupt the timeline that investigators rely on. If police believe a child disappeared Friday morning, they focus their resources on Friday. They interview people about Friday. They look for evidence related to Friday. Meanwhile, the actual crime happened Tuesday, and by the time anyone realizes that, memories have faded, evidence has degraded, witnesses have moved on. Third, you create an alternative narrative. If you report children missing, claim they wandered off, you force investigators to prove a negative. They have to prove the children didn't wander off, which is nearly impossible without a body or physical evidence. The burden shifts. Instead of you having to prove your innocence, they have to prove your guilt. And in the absence of evidence, that's extraordinarily difficult. Fourth, you exploit the presumption of tragedy. When children go missing, the first instinct is sympathy. Parents are victims, not suspects. That presumption buys you time, buys you public support, buys you space to operate before the investigation turns on you. And by the time it does, by the time investigators start looking at you as a suspect rather than a grieving parent, you've had days or weeks to prepare your defense. This is the strategy of concealment, and it's devastatingly effective. But it has one critical weakness. It requires perfect execution. Every detail of the story has to align. Every piece of evidence has to be accounted for. Every timeline has to match. And human beings, especially those under the stress of covering up a crime, make mistakes. They contradict themselves. They forget what they said earlier. They leave traces they didn't even know existed. And that's what happened here. Daniel and Malaya made mistakes. Jack's clothing changed in the retelling. The blanket was found, then it wasn't. The timeline didn't match external witnesses. The behavior didn't match genuine grief. And the dogs that should have found something, anything, found nothing at all because there was nothing there to find. By requesting surveillance from April 27th, the RCMP was documenting those mistakes, building a case piece by piece, waiting for the moment when they'd have enough to move forward with charges. But here's the tragedy beneath the investigation. While police were building their case, while they were requesting footage and re-interviewing witnesses and waiting for forensic results, Lilly and Jack Sullivan remained missing. Their bodies, if they still existed, were somewhere beyond the reach of search teams. Their final moments, whatever horror they experienced, remained known only to the person or persons responsible. If this case is making you angry, if you're feeling that gut-level fury that comes from watching injustice unfold in slow motion, then hit that like button and let me know in the comments what you think happened during those gap days, because we're about to go inside the house itself. We're about to talk about what investigators found when they finally executed search warrants, about the drug paraphernalia, about the chaos, about the life Lilly and Jack were living before they disappeared. And we're about to discuss the network of people who surrounded this family, the ones whose names keep surfacing in connection with the property, the ones who may know far more than they've ever admitted. Tell me where you're watching from, and whether you think justice will ever come for these children, because what comes next is going to show you just how deep this darkness goes. Subscribe now, because the next chapter is about the house everyone avoided, the place where neighbors feared to tread and children were hidden from the world. And when you see what life was really like inside that trailer, you'll understand why no one is surprised these children are gone. Only heartbroken that no one saved them before it was too late. There are places that carry a reputation, a weight that settles over them like fog. In small communities, everyone knows which houses to avoid, which properties have a darkness about them, even if they can't articulate exactly why. The Sullivan property was one of those places. Tucked deep in the Nova Scotia woods, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through dense forest, the trailer sat in isolation. Not the peaceful kind of isolation that people seek when they want privacy. The intentional kind, the kind that keeps people away. And for the neighbors who lived within sight, distant sight, the property had a reputation that made them uneasy. They'd see cars coming and going at strange hours. Headlights cutting through the darkness, well past midnight. Vehicles they didn't recognize, people they'd never seen before. The activity didn't match the pattern of a family quietly living their lives. It matched something else entirely, something that made people lock their doors and mind their own business. And that's exactly how places like this operate, In plain sight but untouchable because everyone's too afraid or too smart to ask questions. When police finally executed search warrants on the property, what they found inside painted a picture that made the disappearance of Lilly and Jack Sullivan feel less like a mystery and more like an inevitability. The trailer was small, the kind of mobile home where every sound carries, where privacy is an illusion. 3 bedrooms, a narrow hallway, a common area, a kitchen barely large enough for one person. In a space that confined 3 children and 2 adults would be on top of each other constantly. There would be no way to miss if someone woke up, if a door opened, if children went outside. The layout itself contradicted the story Daniel and Malaya had told. But it wasn't just the size of the space that was revealing. It was the condition. Investigators described a scene of pervasive neglect. Trash scattered throughout the rooms. Dishes piled in the sink, some with food so old it had fossilized. Surfaces covered in grime. The smell, according to those who entered, was overwhelming, a mixture of decay and chemicals that hit you the moment the door opened. This wasn't a house where children were being cared for. This was a house where children were surviving, if they were lucky. And in the case of Lilly and Jack, it appears their luck ran out. But the neglect, disturbing as it was, wasn't the most damning discovery. Inside the home, investigators found drug paraphernalia. Not marijuana, not remnants of casual recreational use. The kind of paraphernalia associated with hard drugs, with addiction, with a lifestyle incompatible with caring for young children. Pipes, needles, residue that would later be tested and cataloged as evidence. This wasn't hidden away in a locked room. This was out in the open, accessible, part of the daily environment those children were living in. And it explained so much. It explained the odd hours, the unfamiliar cars, the traffic that neighbors had noticed. It explained why the house had an air of avoidance, why people stayed away. It explained the neglect, the chaos, the lack of basic care. Because when addiction takes hold, everything else falls away. Children stop being a priority. Their needs become secondary to the need for the next high. Their safety becomes an afterthought. And in cases like this, when something goes wrong, when an accident happens or a decision is made in a moment of impairment, the response isn't to call for help. It's to hide what happened, to protect yourself from consequences, to make the problem disappear any way you can. One detail that emerged from the investigation was particularly chilling. Child Protective Services had already been involved with the family. There had been prior reports, prior concerns, prior interventions. After the children disappeared, after the investigation was underway, CPS reportedly required Malaya Brooks Murray to leave the residence with the one remaining child, the one who hadn't vanished. That decision, that mandatory removal, tells you everything about what authorities thought about the safety of that home. If CPS is removing children from a parent's custody, it means they've determined there's significant risk of harm. And if they'd already been involved before Lilly and Jack disappeared, it means the warning signs were there. The red flags were waving. The system had touched this family and then, for whatever reason, stepped back. And 2 children paid the price. Now, the involvement of CPS doesn't necessarily mean the parents were directly responsible for whatever happened to Lilly and Jack. But it does establish a pattern of neglect, of unsafe living conditions, of priorities that didn't center on the children's well-being. And in the context of a disappearance that looks increasingly like concealment rather than abduction, that pattern becomes significant. Because people who are already hiding things from authorities, who are already living on the edge of legality, who already have reason to fear investigation, those are the people most likely to cover up a crime rather than report it. But the darkness around this case extends beyond just Daniel and Malaya. As the investigation progressed, other names began surfacing, people connected to the property, people who'd been seen coming and going during those weeks before the children vanished. One name that appeared repeatedly in online discussions and unconfirmed reports was Henry Brooks, a man suspected in the past of drug trafficking and weapons offenses. The exact nature of his relationship to the family was never officially confirmed, but multiple sources suggested he was either related to Malaya or somehow connected to the property. If true, his presence would add another layer to the narrative, another person who might have been there during those gap days, another individual who might know what really happened. Then there was Daniel Martel's older brother, who according to some accounts was a frequent visitor to the home. Neighbors reported seeing multiple adults at the property, not just Daniel and Malaya but others, sometimes several people at once. They described what sounded like parties, loud gatherings that went late into the night, activity that suggested the house was less a family home and more a hub for people engaged in activities they didn't want scrutinized. And in that environment, in that chaos of addiction and criminal activity and people coming and going, 2 small children were trying to survive. Think about what life must have been like for Lilly and Jack in that house, surrounded by adults whose priorities lay elsewhere, living in filth and neglect, exposed to drugs, to paraphernalia, to people who had no business being around children. Kept home from school during those final days, isolated from teachers who might have noticed bruises, malnutrition, signs of abuse. They were invisible to the system, and that invisibility made them vulnerable. Tragically vulnerable. And when something happened, when whatever final terrible event took place, there was no one to intervene, no one to call for help, no one to save them. The investigation into the network of people surrounding the family remains ongoing, at least officially. But years have passed without charges, without arrests, without any public acknowledgement that police have identified suspects beyond Daniel and Malaya. That silence is frustrating to those following the case, but it's also strategic. Because building a case without bodies, without physical evidence, without witnesses willing to testify, requires patience. It requires gathering every piece of circumstantial evidence, every inconsistent statement, every connection, and building them into a narrative that can convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. And sometimes it requires waiting for the right moment, for someone in that network to crack, to feel the weight of conscience, to decide that protecting a child killer isn't worth protecting themselves. But here's what we know for certain, what the evidence and testimony have established beyond dispute. Lilly and Jack Sullivan were living in a house that no child should have to endure. They were surrounded by adults whose lifestyle put them at constant risk. They disappeared during a window of time when only those adults were present. And when their disappearance was finally reported, every detail of the story fell apart under scrutiny. The timeline was wrong. The behavior was wrong. The evidence was wrong. Everything pointed toward something that happened inside that house, not outside in the woods. And the people who know what happened, the people who were there, have said nothing that helps find these children. They've protected themselves while Lilly and Jack remain missing, remain without justice, remain without even the dignity of a proper burial. If you're feeling that sense of helpless rage right now, that fury at a system that failed these children and adults who harmed them and a community that couldn't save them, then tell me in the comments. Tell me you're watching and you haven't forgotten them. Because views and engagement on cases like this keep them alive in the public consciousness, keep pressure on investigators, keep hope alive that someone, somewhere, will finally tell the truth. And make sure you're subscribed, because we're not done yet. We have 2 more chapters, and they're going to bring everything together. We're going to revisit every red flag, every inconsistency, every piece of this puzzle, and show you the picture they create. And then we're going to talk about what happens next, about where this case stands today, about whether justice is even possible anymore. Tell me where you're watching from, share this video, leave a like, because Lilly and Jack Sullivan deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their story told. And they deserve for the people responsible to know that the world is watching, and we haven't looked away. The next chapter is going to walk you through the entire case from beginning to end with the knowledge we have now, showing you how every piece fits together into a narrative that's impossible to ignore. Stay with me, because once you see the full picture, you'll understand why investigators have never given up. Even if the search has ended, the investigation hasn't. And neither has our determination to see these children get the justice they deserve. In every criminal investigation, there's a moment when the case stops being about what happened and starts being about who is involved. When the list of suspects expands from the obvious to the interconnected web of people who surrounded the crime. And in the disappearance of Lilly and Jack Sullivan, that web is tangled, dark, and filled with individuals whose names appear again and again in connection with that property, that house, those final days. The thing about criminal networks, especially those built around drug activity, is that they're inherently unstable. People come and went. Loyalties shift. Someone who's a trusted associate one day becomes a liability the next. And when something goes catastrophically wrong, when children die and investigations intensify, that instability turns into paranoia. People start distancing themselves, cutting ties, making sure they can't be connected to whatever happened. And that's exactly what appears to have unfolded in the aftermath of Lilly and Jack's disappearance. The question investigators have been pursuing isn't just what happened to these children. It's who else was there when it happened and who helped hide it afterward. Let's start with Henry Brooks, a name that's surfaced repeatedly in discussions about this case, though always with careful disclaimers because nothing has been officially confirmed. According to multiple sources, Brooks had a history that included suspected involvement in drug trafficking. The kind of person whose name makes police pay attention, whose associations are tracked, whose movements are monitored. If he was connected to the Sullivan property, if he was part of the network of people coming and going during those weeks before the children vanished, then his presence adds a critical dimension to the investigation. Because people with criminal histories, people already known to law enforcement, people who have reason to avoid police scrutiny, those are exactly the people who might respond to an accidental death or a moment of violence by concealing it rather than reporting it. They're the people who know how to make problems disappear, who have the connections and the resources to move evidence, to dispose of remains, to create alibis. And if someone like that was at the property during those gap days, it would explain a lot about why the cover-up was so thorough and why, years later, there's still no physical evidence to be found. Then there's the matter of Daniel Martel's older brother, another figure who neighbors say was frequently present at the house. The exact nature of his involvement remains unclear, but in cases like this, family connections matter. Because when a crime is committed, the first people someone turns to for help are often family members. And if Daniel needed assistance cleaning a scene, moving evidence, crafting a story, his brother would be a logical person to call. That's speculation, but it's the kind of speculation that investigators pursue because it's grounded in how these situations typically unfold. Blood protects blood, even when blood has done something unforgivable. But the network extended beyond just these individuals. Neighbors reported seeing multiple vehicles at the property, sometimes several at once. They described gatherings that sounded less like family get-togethers and more like something organized around business, the kind of business that happens behind closed doors and doesn't welcome questions. The house, by multiple accounts, had become a hub. And in that environment, with that many people flowing through, the question becomes, who was there during those critical days? Who was present when whatever happened to Lilly and Jack actually occurred? And who, out of all those people, might be persuaded to talk if the pressure becomes intense enough? One of the challenges investigators face in cases like this is the wall of silence that surrounds criminal networks. No one wants to be the first to talk because being the first means becoming a target. Snitches, informants, cooperating witnesses, they face social ostracism at best and violent retaliation at worst. So people stay quiet, even when they know things, even when their conscience weighs on them, because survival instinct overrides moral obligation. But that silence isn't absolute. It cracks under pressure, under the grinding weight of investigation, under the slow realization that someone is going to take the fall for this, and it's better to cooperate than to be left holding the bag. And that's what the RCMP has been waiting for, the moment when someone in this network decides that protecting child killers isn't worth protecting themselves. It might be someone peripheral, someone who was there but didn't participate directly, someone who saw something or heard something and has been carrying that knowledge like a stone. Or it might be someone central, someone whose involvement was direct but who's tired of living under the weight of what they know. Either way, the strategy is the same. Apply pressure, maintain presence, make it clear that the investigation hasn't gone away and won't go away until someone breaks. There's another element to this network that can't be ignored. The drug connection. If the Sullivan property was indeed a site of drug activity, if people were coming there to buy, to use, to deal, then the house wasn't just a residence. It was a business location. And businesses, especially illegal ones, keep records of a sort. People remember who was there and when. Financial transactions, even informal ones, leave traces. Phones ping off cell towers. Vehicles get spotted by neighbors or by police patrols in the area. All of that creates a web of data that investigators can use to map who was present during those gap days. And once you have that map, once you know who is there, you start applying pressure to the weakest links. You find the person with the most to lose, or the person with the least loyalty, and you make them an offer. Immunity in exchange for testimony. Reduced charges in exchange for cooperation. And slowly, piece by piece, the story comes together. But here's the tragedy in all of this. While investigators work to unravel the network, while they build their case and apply their pressure and wait for someone to crack, Lilly and Jack Sullivan remain missing. Their bodies, if they still exist in any recoverable form, are somewhere known only to the people responsible. And every day that passes, every month, every year, makes recovery less likely. Organic material degrades. Evidence disappears. Memories fade. And the chance that these children will ever be found, that their family will ever have closure, diminishes. The network that surrounded the Sullivan house, the people who came and went and knew what was happening inside, they're not just witnesses to neglect. Some of them, maybe all of them, are witnesses to whatever happened to those children. And their silence, their collective decision to protect themselves rather than speak for Lilly and Jack, is its own form of guilt. Because at some point, staying silent stops being about self-preservation and becomes active participation in the cover-up. It becomes complicity. And morally, if not always legally, complicity makes you responsible. If you're feeling that anger building, that sense that everyone connected to this case failed these children, then I need you to do something. I need you to share this video. Get it in front of more people. Keep this case in the public eye. Because the more attention cases like this receive, the more pressure builds on the network, the more likely it becomes that someone will break. And I need you to subscribe because we're almost at the end, and the final chapter is going to bring everything together. We're going to walk through every red flag one more time, show you the pattern, show you the picture they create when you step back and see them all at once. And we're going to talk about what comes next, about where this case stands, about whether there's any hope left for justice. Tell me in the comments who you think was responsible, whether you believe it was just Daniel and Malaya or whether the network runs deeper. Because sometimes the worst crimes aren't committed by one person in a moment of rage. They're committed by a system of people who collectively decide that two children's lives matter less than their own freedom. And that's what we're dealing with here. Not a tragedy. A conspiracy of silence that has let killers walk free for years. The next chapter is the final one, and it's going to leave you with the complete picture and the questions that still haunt everyone who's followed this case. Stay with me to the end, because Lilly and Jack deserve to have their entire story told. And we're going to tell it. There's a weight that settles over a case like this. Not the weight of evidence, because there's almost none. Not the weight of testimony, because the only people who know the truth won't speak it. It's the weight of knowing. Of understanding what happened even when you can't prove it. Of seeing the pattern so clearly that the lack of a conviction feels like a failure of the system rather than a failure of the investigation. And that's where we are with Lilly and Jack Sullivan. We know. We just can't prove it in a way that satisfies the legal threshold of beyond reasonable doubt. But let's walk through this one final time, because when you lay it all out, when you see every piece of evidence and every inconsistency side by side, the picture that emerges is undeniable. Two children, 6-year-old Lilly and 4-year-old Jack, disappeared from a remote property in Nova Scotia. Their parents claimed they vanished on the morning of May 2nd, that they'd been playing outside and simply wandered into the woods. But external witnesses, the school bus driver and teachers, confirmed those children hadn't been seen since April 29th, 3 days earlier. That gap, those 72 unaccounted hours, they're the foundation of everything wrong with this case. During those gap days, no one outside the family saw Lilly and Jack. There were no doctor's visits despite claims that Lilly was sick. No calls to school. No communication with anyone who could verify the children were alive and well. Just two adults, Daniel Martel and Malaya Brooks Murray, alone with 3 children in an isolated trailer deep in the woods. And when they finally called police on May 2nd, they told a story that immediately began to fall apart. They said the children had walked out the sliding glass door that morning without waking anyone. But the house was too small for that to be believable. The door was loud, The space was confined, and two adults sleeping just feet away would have heard something. They said the children had been playing outside. But there were only two boot prints in the dirt, isolated impressions that looked more like staging than genuine evidence of play. They described specific items the children were wearing: Lily's backpack, Jack's pull-up diaper, the pink boots and blue boots. But those descriptions changed in the retelling, details shifting as if the story was being adjusted on the fly rather than recalled from memory. They mentioned Lily's pink blanket, Daniel saying it had been found, Malaya later suggesting it was still missing. They couldn't keep their own narrative consistent. And then the search began, massive, expensive, exhaustive. Helicopters, drones, ground teams, K-9 units. Every resource available was deployed to find these children. And they found nothing. Not a piece of clothing, not a broken branch, not a scent trail. The dogs, trained animals with years of experience, animals that can find people in conditions that seem impossible, they alerted on nothing. As if Lily and Jack had never been in those woods at all. And that absence of evidence, that complete and total lack of any trace, it told investigators exactly what they needed to know. Those children didn't wander off. Whatever happened to them happened inside the house, and their bodies were removed in a way that left no trail. The search was suspended after 7 days, then resumed not in new areas but back at the property itself, with cadaver dogs specifically. That decision, that pivot from rescue to recovery, from external search to internal investigation, marked the moment when everyone involved knew this wasn't a missing persons case anymore. This was a homicide investigation without a body. Then came the surveillance request, footage from April 27th onward. 5 days before the parents claimed the children disappeared. That request was the RCMP saying, as clearly as they could without making a public accusation, that they didn't believe the official story. They were investigating a different timeline, one where the crime happened days earlier, and the report was delayed to allow for cleanup and preparation. And finally, there was the behavior of the parents themselves. Daniel, too smooth, too scripted, repeating his statements word for word like an actor who'd over-rehearsed. Offering to take a polygraph, but under conditions that delayed everything. Describing the children as too trusting, setting up a narrative of abduction before anyone had suggested it. Malaya, using we instead of I, diffusing responsibility, avoiding ownership. And then disappearing entirely, climbing into an ambulance during a search meeting and never coming back, cutting ties with Daniel, changing her relationship status while her children were still missing, going dark in a way that screamed strategic withdrawal rather than grief. Neither parent behaved like someone who'd lost their children. They behaved like people managing a crisis of their own making. And when investigators finally got inside that house, what they found confirmed every suspicion. Neglect, filth, drug paraphernalia, a life incompatible with caring for children. Child Protective Services had already been involved. The house was a hub for people with criminal connections, for activity that happened in darkness and secrecy. It was the kind of place where something could go terribly wrong, and the first instinct wouldn't be to call for help. It would be to hide it, to protect the adults, to make the children disappear so the life they were living could continue without interruption. That's what all of this points to. Not an accident that was panicked over and concealed in a moment of fear, but something calculated, something that involved multiple people, something that required planning and time, and a network of individuals willing to stay silent. And that silence, that wall of complicity, is what's kept this case from resolution. Because without bodies, without physical evidence, without someone breaking ranks and telling what they know, prosecutors can't move forward. They can't charge anyone, can't bring a case to trial, can't get justice for Lily and Jack. And so the case sits, officially ongoing but functionally stalled. Years pass, anniversaries come and go, and two small children remain, missing without even the dignity of graves. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with anger, with frustration, with the knowledge that somewhere in that network of people, someone knows exactly what happened. Someone was there. Someone helped. Someone is carrying that knowledge and choosing, every single day, to protect themselves rather than speak for two children who can't speak for themselves. And it leaves us with questions that may never be answered. Are Lilly and Jack's remains still in Nova Scotia, buried somewhere in that vast wilderness, or were they moved farther, disposed of in a way that makes recovery impossible? Did Daniel Martel act alone, or was Malaya equally involved? And what role did the others play, the people who came and went from that property, the network that surrounded this family? Were they just witnesses to neglect, or were they active participants in whatever happened? We may never know, but we can keep asking. We can keep watching. We can keep this case alive in the public consciousness so that investigators know people haven't forgotten, so that the network knows the pressure hasn't lifted, so that maybe someday someone's conscience will outweigh their fear and the truth will finally emerge. Lilly and Jack Sullivan deserved so much better than the life they were given. They deserved safety, love, protection. They deserved to grow up, to have futures, to be more than a true crime case. And while we can't give them that now, we can refuse to let them be forgotten. We can tell their story. We can demand accountability. We can make sure that even without justice, there is memory. Because sometimes, when the legal system fails, all that's left is bearing witness. All that's left is refusing to look away. If this case has affected you, if you've stayed with me through this entire journey, then I'm asking you one final time. Like this video. Share it. Get it in front of as many people as possible. The more attention cases like this receive, the more pressure builds. And pressure creates cracks. Cracks let truth through. And maybe, just maybe, that truth will finally bring Lilly and Jack home. Tell me in the comments what you think happened. Share your theory, your anger, your hope that somehow justice will still come. Tell me where you're watching from so we can see how far this story has traveled, how many people are paying attention, how many voices are demanding answers. And if you want to see more cases like this, cases that ask hard questions and refuse easy answers, cases that demand accountability, even when the system falls short, then subscribe. Because there are too many Lillys and Jacks out there, too many children who slip through the cracks, too many stories that need to be told. Thank you for following Lilly and Jack Sullivan's story to the end. Thank you for caring enough to watch, to listen, to remember. These children deserved better. And while we can't change what happened, we can refuse to let it be buried in silence. Share your thoughts, share your feelings, share your final theory in the comments. And know that by watching, by engaging, by refusing to forget, you're keeping these children's memory alive. You're keeping pressure on those responsible. And you're making sure that even if justice is delayed, it isn't abandoned. Lilly and Jack Sullivan. Say their names. Remember them. And never stop asking what happened in those woods, in that house, during those days when no one was watching. Because the answer is out there. Someone knows it. And someday, that someone is going to tell. Until then, we keep watching. We keep asking. And we don't look away.